I am Molly Knight, and this is my Civil War podcast. Today, we are going to be discussing education during the Civil War, specifically in children that would be considered in grades K through 12 today. So, we are going to kick this off by going through what life was like for students, specifically in the southern colonies. In most southern states, before the 1860s, they had a pretty rudimentary public school system, which basically means they had very basic subjects that they would teach. They weren't as academic as the northern colonies. However, throughout the 1860s, academies started popping up more and more. So a typical school day for a student would involve walking to school, no matter what season. And these walks could be anywhere from 1 to, I've seen up to 5 mile walks in summer, in winter, any season. And the most information I could find was for the education of boys. I think in the South, women weren't really prioritized when it came to education. But what I could find is that most Southern boys would go to school during the winter when they were not needed on any farms. And they would typically attend an academy that used military type training that would prepare them for military service. So it was very much focused on either giving you back to the farm to work or serving in the military. Again, not very focused as much on academics. When it comes to the education of girls in the Civil War, typically they would go during the summertime when their brothers would be working on farms. This kind of back and forth system of girls going to school during the summer and boys in the winter actually contributes to modern day practices of having summer breaks off from school. I thought that was pretty interesting, so I wanted to put that in here. Now, the southern states and western states actually have pretty similar education systems, so I'm going to save information on how teachers were treated and their social expectations for my western section of the podcast. So I'm going to go ahead and switch gears and talk about the education of freed Black Americans during and after the Civil War. So before the Civil War, no more than 10 to 15% of the Black population in the South was literate. So northern churches actually dispatched many teachers to go and teach them how to read, and these teachers would teach not only children but also freed adults. So many Black people in the South started learning how to read, which was a revolutionary act because it now gave them skills and the tools where they could combat the racism that had oppressed them for so long by writing about their experiences and appealing to those fighting against them. Another aspect of schooling that I want to talk about is discipline. So this is pretty universal throughout all Southern education of both white and Black children, and also on the Western frontier. However, my first source quote is from a teacher of freed Black children, so I figured I could put it in here. Many schools used corporal punishment, so typically hitting students with rulers or spanking them. I have a quote here from Sarah Chase, who was dispatched by a northern church to teach in the South, and she said, quote, "Many a father and mother have begged me to beat their children at school. Spare the rod and spoil the child is on every mother's tongue. Now you whip her and make a good girl out of her, the kindest mother says, when she trusts her sweetest child to us." End quote. And that is from a letter that she wrote in July 1st, 1864. Now, like I said, this form of punishment was pretty universal. However, another universal punishment that was used was public humiliation, actually. Many students would be made to wear dunce caps, which is a white cone-shaped hat, and they would be put in the corner, and be stared at by all of their classmates and be seen as a dunce for that period of time. Obviously, with modern psychology and education, we know that that is not good for children. However, this was the normal. Now, on March 3rd, 1865, Congress passed an act to establish a Bureau for the Relief of Freedmen and Refugees, which further secured Black Americans' right to education post-war. According to David Blight, quote, they, meaning Black Americans, embraced education like nothing else. They lined up in droves, old and young, to go to night school, to go to morning school. They would work afternoons or work mornings to enter all manner of buildings that became freedmen's schools just to achieve basic literacy and then some education beyond that. What was at stake was a sense of a new future. Some of them, no doubt, were sort of crushed by that responsibility, that challenge, but most of them embraced it, end quote. Now, this is where we're going to switch directions and move to the Western frontier. Now, surprisingly, there is a lot of information out there on education in the Western frontier at this time, and this can be pretty well attributed to the Little House on the Prairie series, actually. I guess that piece of media got people really interested in life out west during this time period, so that's pretty cool. And this is where I got a lot of information about teachers, responsibilities, and expectations at this time. And this can be implemented throughout the western and southern states. So do keep that in mind that this applies to our previous locations that we have already discussed. So teachers were expected to whittle pencils for their students, and they were very restricted on what they could do with their life. They basically were supposed to be dedicated completely to education and the church and nothing else. They were expected to read the Bible in their spare time. They weren't allowed to drink, smoke. They couldn't attend social halls. Women were not allowed to date or marry, however, men could. And teachers, again, were requested frequently by parents to use corporal punishment and humiliation. So, keeping in mind all of these expectations around teachers, you would think that a similar amount of concern would be directed towards the curriculum and actual education of students, but it was actually quite the opposite. It was even more basic than education in the South. Children would go to school and only be expected to learn how to read and write. That was it. There was no math, no history, no science, absolutely none of that. They basically went to school to learn to read the Bible, and they would go back to work on their family farm. Now, we do have to keep in mind that this lack of curriculum does have to do with the lack of resources that Western communities had at this point in time. They were the newest states acquired by the U.S. and were not nearly as established as, say, the northern colonies were. Teachers actually were paid so little that they had to house with the families of their students. And some sources said that they would share beds with their students. Very small schoolhouses were provided. However, they all didn't have desks or reading materials other than the Bible and very long wooden benches. Most schoolhouses used pencils, but some areas had to resort to using quill and ink as a substitute, or slate boards and chalk. So, as much interest is, invested into the Western frontier at this time, there actually isn't really much to learn. They followed the same summer-winter schedule as southern states, where, again, boys would go in the winter, girls in the summer. They would walk to school a very similar distance as southern states, anywhere from 1 to 5 miles. And yeah. So now we are going to begin discussing the northern states, which are wildly different from every other school system I have described so far, we have to keep in mind the northern colonies were very, very well established at this point, and this is the hub of academia, and we can see remnants of this to this day. Obviously, a lot of Ivy Leagues are located in this area for a reason. In the North, push for education, specifically common education, began in the 1830s when Massachusetts legislator Horace Mann began advocating for state-funded public schools that would be available to all free of charge. Common schools would often teach the, quote, 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, along with other subjects such as history, geography, grammar, and a strong dose of moral instruction would also be provided. One interesting fact that I found in my research was that by the 5th year of school, students in these northern colonies were reading material at a level which is today considered to be college level. So they were actually reading what we would consider college level books in 4th or 5th grade practically. And in the North, it was very common for children to attend academies that had very intensive educational experience. Children that attended these academies were typically aged 13 to 20 and came from wealthy families who would often board their children at said academy. Although middle to upper class families could also send their children here without having to pay room and board for a daytime education. These academies provided a variety of classes. For example, John B. Carey's Hampton, Virginia Male and Female Academy offered classes in Greek, Latin, French, German, Italian, Spanish, as well as chemistry, natural philosophy, and astronomy. As at most academies, the boys and girls were kept separated. So that has been my breakdown for how schools differentiated between the South, West, and Northern colonies. So now we can focus on how the war actually affected these schools. To begin where we just left off, in the Northern colonies, the war didn't really directly affect any academies or common schools. They were well enough established that they were protected, and kids that were boarded at these academies were kept pretty safe. Now, on the western frontier, there was not exactly any negative impact on schooling. However, families may have kept their children from going, but the schools themselves were not directly affected. It was more personal choices began to change. Now, most information about the war affecting schools, as you may have inferred, is that they typically affected male academies in the South, which makes a lot of sense as these academies already were teaching their students to basically go straight to the military. For example, many academies actually closed during the war to become armories and other military type facilities, and typically around a quarter to a third of students would serve together in a unit. And finally, as I kind of went over when we were talking about the education of freed Black children, post-war there was a bureau that was created to protect many things for the new freedmen, including their education. And as many of you may know, education remained segregated for many decades to come after this point. Of course, there was a long way to go post-war when it came to that. So that has been my Civil War podcast. I hope you guys found my little fun facts that I added in here as interesting as I did. It really was interesting to see how starkly different the northern colonies were from the southern and western colonies. So I think I will conclude it here. Bye, guys.